The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud.
It's also very real world. We all participate in the financial sector in one way or another. So although you can view these things as abstract, actually, I know my payments are going through these systems. So it's a very real part of your life.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML, compliance and financial crime to the real world. Sometimes on this podcast, we bring you insights into how the criminals are working against those in the compliance and AML space. But also, it's just as important to talk about the new innovations on this side of the divide. Transaction screening is like that extra second of bullet time that you see in the films, where the action hero moves in slow motion and everything whizzes around them. It's that extra second before a transaction goes through, which could be the difference between stopping the criminals getting wired the funds or not. I'm your host, Fredrik Riiser, Head of Strategy and Business Development at Strise. And in this episode, we're discussing everything you need to know about transaction screening. And by everything, we mean everything. We'll be discussing what transaction screening looks like today, the biggest challenges still in its way, and what the future holds in this space. To dive into this topic, I'm here with Nick Portalski, Chief Solutions and Security Officer at Napier AI. Welcome to The Laundry, Nick. Can you tell our listeners about you, your background, and something about Napier AI?
Certainly, and thank you for the introduction, Fredrik. So my name is Nick Portalski. I've been working in the AML space since Napier AI started back in 2015, so very nearly 9 years. We were a very small startup back then, so I've done a variety of roles in the organisation, but always on the product or technical side, and also always very actively involved with customers, both on the kind of the pre-sales and the implementation side. My background more generally is in software development and enterprise architectures. I've been working in the IT industry for a little over 30 years across a range of domains in companies ranging from the very small to the very large, such as IBM. Napier AI itself is a software product company. We provide a range of AML compliance solutions from transaction screening, transaction monitoring, client screening, and we provide those to organizations around the world. And we have teams around the world and have grown, as I said, from 4 people back in 2015 to a worldwide organization of more than 200 people with customers around the world.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for transparency. We'll mention that we're lucky at Strise to be working with Napier on a strategic partnership and where we will be covering the end-to-end of the AML value chain. There's more information on that coming to all the listeners soon, but I think we should jump straight into the topic of today. So let's start by looking at what do we actually mean by transaction screening. So for those who may not know, or that's just starting their journey within compliance now, could you describe transaction screening in its simplest terms?
Certainly, yes. And it's one of those topics that you start simple and then suddenly there's all sorts of additional pieces. But yes, it has a very simple core, which is, as a financial institution, can I pay this transaction now? So transaction screening is a real-time decision. Right now, can I pay this transaction? Can I pay typically means, at a high level, are there any red flags from a regulatory point of view or financial crime point of view that mean I shouldn't pay it? Although that can be fairly broad, in most cases, what that means is this money potentially going to a sanctioned individual or entity? And if it is, then I shouldn't pay it, at least until I've investigated that. So that at its core is it. Is there a risk that this payment is going somewhere it shouldn't, and I therefore need to stop it right now?
And transaction monitoring is something most processes revolve around. That's usually what we hear in the market as well. Transaction monitoring this and transaction monitoring that. Transaction screening seems to come as a bit of a second focus area when it comes to blocking transactions or figuring out exactly where the funds are wired and so forth. What is the difference between transaction monitoring and transaction screening?
I think one of the problems, and we'll potentially touch on this a little more later, is people do use the terms interchangeably at times. But strictly speaking, transaction monitoring, and to go back to your example of bullet time, is kind of a slow time decision. You are looking for patterns of behavior for customers or accounts. And importantly, you are doing it after the event. So if someone was monitoring my account and my money movements, they might be monitoring the way I use the account over a long period of time. There might be alerts that trigger within that period of time, but they are doing an evaluation to try and determine, do I represent a money laundering risk or a terrorism funding risk over a period of time? And you might be using lots of rules and AI and comparing, the way I use my account now to the way I used it last year to make that decision. Transaction screening is really looking at one thing at once. Can this money go to this destination party right now? And the answer might change tomorrow. And the answer for the next transaction may be different. So I would say transaction monitoring, traditionally, end of day, batch process, looking at millions of transactions at once. Transaction screening, real-time decision, looking at the single transaction at this point in time and where is it going and do I need to stop it? So they are, although they share a name, they are very different processes on the transactions. One is I make a decision on this transaction. The other is I make a decision based on a large number of transactions over time.
And what kind of data points are different between looking at those two, transaction screening and transaction monitoring?
So transaction screening, and again, it can be broadened. Some organizations do slightly different things, but the core is typically party names. So what's the name of the party it came from? What's the name it's going to? You might use a couple of other data points, such as BIC codes of banks, because they may be a BIC code that's been sanctioned. But typically you are looking at some core identifying information about the parties that the money is going to or transferring through. In transaction monitoring, you are looking at a broader history of the way money has come in and out of the account over time. You may also be comparing it to other accounts that are similar. In the sense you might have if it's a retail account or an individual account, you'd compare someone's activity to other accounts in the same country of the same risk level. So you're using potentially a large amount of data to determine if an account is being used suspiciously. Whereas transaction screening, each decision is really individual. You may, during your investigation, make some rules to say, don't show me this again, but it's a very single point in time decision.
Would it be fair to say that transaction monitoring is more focused on the actual numbers, the actual funds going in and out of accounts and rules that set up to sort of screen towards different amounts, potentially bigger amounts than the party had said that they would wire to another country, and be more focused on using internal data and internal rules as opposed to transaction screening focusing more on external data sets and such as UBOs, perhaps sanctions or other risk flags or risk indicators as well?
Yes, that's certainly true. And you're right, transaction screening, most organizations will use data from a provider, which effectively is the data on the sanctions list, to make a decision. And very simple transaction monitoring rules might be, as you say, is a customer depositing more cash than they said when they were onboarded? Are they depositing more cash than, or are they saving more money than other similar accounts? Now, obviously, you can build much more sophisticated rules around, say, high velocity accounts, where you're using a number of factors on the account to determine actually it might be being used for purposes you'd rather it wasn't being used. So yes, transaction monitoring tends to use data available to the organization about that customer, about other accounts. It's less about external data. Transaction screening tends to be more about implementing rules that, effectively a government appointed agency like OFAC or HMT has put in place and said, no, as a UK institution, you can't pay money to these individuals. And then the bank is trying to make sure that they don't do that. There can be a little bit of an overlap in sometimes some organizations will use screening as a way to block a payment because maybe it starts to break their own internal rules, which might be the amount of money I've moved abroad this month. But that's less about the regulatory regime and just more around rules that they want to impose.
Can we talk a bit about how the space has evolved over the last 5 to 10 years from your perspective?
So on the kind of the problem side of it, I think there have been two big changes. Part of this was happening anyway, but obviously the COVID pandemic meant there are just significantly more transactions. So there is less use of cash. There are more electronic transactions. Partly because of that, the number of payment providers, the number of ways in which you can move money around the world has grown significantly. So there are just more routes for people to move money around, and there are more transactions going on. Equally, the political climate tended to put sanctions at the forefront of everyone's mind.
Back here in Washington, President Biden announced hundreds of new sanctions on Russia on the eve of the 2-year mark of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the mysterious death of opposition leader Alexei Navalny.
Make no mistake, Putin is responsible for Alexei's death.
The sweeping sanctions unveiled by President Biden include penalties on those specific individuals who ran the Arctic penal colony, where detained opposition leader Alexei Navalny died 1 week ago.
We in the United States are going to continue to ensure that Putin pays the price for his aggression abroad and repression at home.
In total, there are roughly 600 new sanctions on individuals and entities in Russia and 11 other countries, including China, Serbia, and the United Arab Emirates.
So the Russian invasion of Ukraine tended to make Western governments realize that the gap between putting someone on a sanction list or an entity on a sanction list and that actually having an effect. And remember, sanctions are to an extent a political tool. So that the time between an organisation saying, yep, this person is now on a sanction list, and that actually stopping money moving to that person, governments want that to be as short as possible. And I think the number of transactions, the number of ways of moving money, and the sanction regimes becoming, across the world slightly more important, slightly more visible to people, have meant organisations realise that, maybe this was a bigger problem than they thought. On the other side, technologies move much faster. So it is a compute problem. You are comparing millions of names at speed and at scale. And the technology you need to do that has become commoditized. So it starts to become practical to do more of this. Again, driven by various reasons, the providers of data are providing better quality data. I think the regulators have changed to encourage organizations to make risk-based decisions. And this is worth picking up again in a second, but there isn't a one-size-fits-all to screening. You need to go, where's the money going? What's the risk? What's the regulatory regime in the destination that I'm sending the money to? So there's been more emphasis on that.
And you mentioned that technology has obviously evolved as well over the last 5 years to help keep up with the changes and the new type of problems. But would you say there's a divide between the companies that has the funds and the ability to invest in these type of technologies and the ones that doesn't? Hypothetically, this could be a difference between a large financial institutions and a neobank, as an example.
I think if you went back 5 to 10 years, only if you went back to when Napier AI started, that would have been true, because the infrastructure you needed, you needed your own data centers, you needed your own software license, you had to buy a potentially expensive product. That was probably true. It's an interesting space to be in. We started an organization to be in this space. So it has become more commoditized. So I think that gap between what is possible and what the regulator expects you to be able to do as a huge global tier one and what it expects you to do as a relatively new payment provider has shrunk, because actually the bar to entrance is significantly less. We're here to help do this. There are other organizations, and you don't need your own data center. You can use a hosted solution. So no, I don't think that is true on the technology space. I think on the policy and process, the organization still has to understand what is their risk appetite, what are they actually obliged to screen. And I think that's one of the challenges, and we can come on to talking around those, the organizations still face. But from a tech point of view, clearly there is always going to be a gap, but it is far smaller than it was in terms of how much you need to actually perform this function than it was 5 years ago.
And you mentioned there that the biggest blocker might be, or one of the biggest blockers might be on the process side. What are the biggest barriers for those looking to better these processes or better their transaction screening setups today?
It's a really good question. And I think if you work backwards and say, well, why not just screen every transaction against every possible sanction list in the world? Because it's an innumerable problem. But you have two challenges, one of which, it is a compute problem. So you are going to be paying for the infrastructure to do that. But One of the big challenges with transaction screening compared to, say, client screening, where you tend to have dates of birth and passports and a lot more information, transaction screening, you've got a name and potentially a country. There are a lot of sanction lists. There's a lot of names on the sanction list. So false positives are quite common because there are simply a lot of matches, because names can only be so unique, particularly if you start saying, I'm not after an exact name, just something similar, you will get a lot of matches. It's very difficult within the context of a transaction to provide additional information. You typically don't have a huge amount about where the money's going. So you take the other approach and you say, well, I should be screening against the least possible. I don't screen against names. There is no regulatory requirement, or my own policies don't require me to do that. So that means you have to understand the regulations. And if you're sending money around the world, that means you need to understand more than one regulation. If you're sending a dollar payment to the US, is that different to a dollar payment to Qatar? Is that different to an Australian dollar payment from the UK to Australia? But you need to understand all that in order to really bring your screening down to the least possible scope, because you want to be compliant. You want to make sure you are screening against what you need to, but not over screening. And I'd say the biggest challenge is over-screening, which means screening against more names than you need to. So you are more likely to get a hit. So you're more likely to need to investigate it. And it's more likely to be a false positive. So you spend more time making a decision. And that is partly down to an understanding of the regulatory regimes and the policies, but also understanding what is your own risk appetite. And I'd say this is probably the core of it. Not all regulators are the same, but most are pushing people and financial institutions to make risk-based decisions. And they'll say, you need to do screening, you need to make sure sanctioned entities and people aren't being paid, do that on a risk-based decision. So if I'm a UK bank and I'm sending money to an account in another UK bank, that's a pretty safe transaction. We trust the regulatory regime of the other UK bank. We know they will have gone through onboarding. I could probably make a risk-based decision not to screen that payment at payment time. But if the money is going to a regime and an account I know nothing about and a regime I trust less, that's probably one I should screen. So it's really being able to make that risk-based assessment and back it up to the regulator so that you can then use the technology to screen what's left quickly and efficiently, and ideally not have to spend a lot of time reviewing.
What would you say are the biggest challenges when it comes to integrating these type of new solutions with the already existing systems put into place?
It's a good question, because I've always viewed transaction screening as one of those that is actually easier to implement. Transaction monitoring, as we said earlier, you can actually take data from the KYC system, the CRM system. You might have a huge backlog of transactions. You want to look back over years worth of data and you've got millions of customers. Transaction screening is a real-time decision. So that implies a level of API-based integration. Again, go back 10 years, that might have been a little bit more of an issue, less so now. So there is not a huge amount of information. I say, here's my transaction, please screen it. Here's the configuration I want to screen it against, and I get a response. I think the hardest part of the technical integration is actually what happens afterwards. So I request a transaction, the system comes back and says, actually, there's a risk, you need to manually review that. I look through it and I make a decision later and go, no, it's all fine, you can pay this transaction. I've probably had an SLA. The clock's been ticking. Someone's waiting for their transaction. Does it time out? How long have I got? When I make the decision, how do I tell the payment engine you're now good to pay that? Or how do I tell it, no, please never pay this? So I think there's when we look at the integration, there's two parts. There's the initial, is this payment okay? That's actually quite easy. There's not a lot of data. It's a real-time call. The slightly harder one, which just needs a little bit of thinking about up front, is how does the eventual decision get back? But again, whether it's webhooks or polling, it's a relatively simple set of patterns. So in general, certainly in our implementations, we don't really see a particular barrier around transaction screening. I would just say knowing the volume, making sure that you've sized your infrastructure. We have clients who can be optimistic about their volume and clients who will underestimate it. And actually, it's a real-time process. People are sitting there waiting for the decision for the payment to get made. So, the biggest challenge around integration, I'd actually say, is understanding your realistic volume and sizing it appropriately.
And that's one of the key changes in the market as well. The way that I read it is this moving towards real-time payments that's cross-border as well, because that's a big difference. Talk to us a bit about what that means for transaction screening?
That's, certainly here in the UK, the faster payment service, the ability, if I move money into an account, it'll be there within 10 minutes. As you start to move to cross-border payments, and everyone wants cross-border instant payments, the problem you've started to get is all the regulations are different. I'll pick a random example. The Italian government, or the Italian regulator rather, might have a different set of sanction lists from the UK. There'll be quite an overlap, but they might be slightly different. So the technology to enable cross-border payments, pretty straightforward. But understanding actually what am I responsible for in the UK versus the receiving end. And certainly if you start to think about cross-border payments going through multiple parties, and there's always been the concept of correspondent banks, but as you start to move the money between 4 or 5 points in the chain, well, any one of those potentially could be a sanctioned entity, could be a sanctioned bank. So who's responsible for that? Who's building up the chain? We see message formats for use in Europe. Suddenly the amount of data that the payment message can contain, the number of parties involved, starts to become quite large. And if the expectation is they're all going to be screened, well, there's a point where trying to do that sub-second gets difficult. So implicitly, you've either got to throw an awful lot of infrastructure at it, it gets expensive, people want these payments to be ideally free, or it's going to take more time. So yes, cross-border is the next problem to be cracked in terms of speed and understanding what the requirements are as you move between regulators in different countries.
I think now is the time to take a quick break, and we'll be right back talking to Nick about the exciting future of transaction screening. Be right back.
Live on stage in London.
The Launder Live is back in London. On Wednesday, the 30th of October, we're gathering AML megaminds from across the industry for a night of networking and insights at the world-renowned Ministry of Sound venue. We'll be bringing you a killer keynote, a live podcast recording, a DJ set, light shows, refreshments, and more. It's going to be the biggest event for AML and compliance professionals this year, so don't miss it. Tickets are available now for free. No dynamic pricing here. Follow the link in the show notes and pick up yours now.
And welcome back. Having looked at what we mean by transaction screening and some of the current challenges, let's move into a chat about the future. So, Nick, if you could wave a magic wand or a magic compliance wand and put everything in place, how would transaction screening work in a perfect world, according to you?
Yeah, good question, and would love to have a perfect world. And I think I'll touch on technology at once, but I don't really see this as a technology problem in terms of it's not a magic technical wand. A lot of it is about process and regimes. So one of the challenges at the moment is because I don't think it's always clear who should screen what, particularly when we're talking about things like cross-border. Every party ends up screening everything every time. So the world is massively over-screening. So I think there is a screen once decision. So if a payment is going between multiple countries, how do you avoid screening the beneficiary multiple times? That's hard because different regimes might say, well, you need to screen it against different things. How do you start tracking what it has been screened? If the payment sat there for half a day, we weren't looking for solutions here, but minimize the screening as you go across different regimes. The fewer differences there were around screening, the better. That cross-border payments and different regulators wanting to do different things are always going to knock up against each other. But you asked about a compliant wand, and it would be for significant more consistency around what to screen when, and therefore that starts to allow you to only screen things once as they flow through. I think the other part of it is, and this is really going back to its use as a tool, which is in a perfect world, from the point in time a regulator or the body making the decisions in the country decides someone should be on a list, to that taking effect should be as short as possible. Parties and organisations typically know if they're going to be sanctioned. So you want, if it's going to be an effective tool, you want the opportunity to move money to be as short as possible. It could quite realistically be 24, 36 hours at the moment. So that means the providers need to find a way to make that more real time. Organisations such as us need to be able to ingest that data in real time. But that might mean accepting decisions aren't always perfect. how much do you review a decision and put something on a sanction list before you publish it? But I do think in a perfect world with that magic wand, you would find a way to significantly reduce the amount of time between the decision being made and payment starting to take that into account. The core of transaction screening from a technology point of view is name matching. How similar is this name to that name? That's always going to be a challenging problem. But what we are seeing with the use of AI, and it's quite different to transaction monitoring AI, where you really are studying patterns of transactional behavior, is the AI learning from a compliance officer to be able to make decisions instead of a person needing to look at it. So there's a set of information, there's a set of policies and processes. A compliance officer will look at a payment, will look at all the data they've got and say, actually, I'm going to block this payment or I'm going to let it through. That is here's a set of information, here's a decision. You can train AI models with that and then start to use that as a decision-making tool. Now, that also needs the regulators to be on board and so on. But, that is where I do think it will go. And that is the technology angle on this, is really to have AI making more of the payment decisions.
To get value out of this, I would assume that you would need some sort of global data set to tap into so that everybody would be able to look at the same set of data. So hypothetically, regulations in Italy and regulations in the UK might differ slightly. With the new policies, like you mentioned now, they might be more similar so that everything is screened once. However, the bank in Italy would need to tap into the same data set as the bank in the UK to see that it actually has been screened that one time. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yes, you'd need to, and I think, you could use things, there are ideas from blockchain in terms of maintaining a ledger of what's been done. Because you're right, I just can't send a message to the bank in Italy saying, oh, trust me, I've screened this party already. There has to be more than that. So yes, I'm not seeing it saying that would be an easy problem, but you would want the organisations to build a technical model that ensures that when the bank in the UK says, yes, I've screened this party against these lists, that the bank in Italy can trust that decision. The lists are all published, but they're very raw. And then obviously what you are paying the intelligence data providers for is to effectively publish and deduplicate those lists. And there is always then a problem as to, well, I've been using Dow Jones to make a decision, the Italian bank is using Refinitiv, how do I correlate those? And you may eventually need more global identifiers. But at what point, and this is the counter argument, at what point is are the regulators moving into a commercial market? They generally don't want to act in that way. They're setting out rules and frameworks and then allowing the market to establish how to do that. And I think those are potentially competing requirements at times.
And what are the consequences of, especially banks, which most often are the institutions where they have the infrastructure to move money around cross-border and actually wire these funds? What are the consequences of them not getting this right, both for themselves in terms of potentially customer experience and so forth, as well as the societal responsibility they have to try to hinder criminalities getting hold of more funds to fund the criminal ventures?
Yeah, well, I mean, for the institution, it's being fined. So, eventually, if you don't have an effective sanction screening process and you have or are found to have not put an appropriate structure in place, you could be fined, and those fines can be significant. Clearly, some of the fines for financial institutions are huge. And if we ignore that aspect, the other part, and again, I'd use sanctions typically are something of a political tool, but usually with good reason for that government. They want to effectively enforce policy or make it clear that they're not happy about a particular country's actions. So if there are ways to get around those sanctions, then they cease to become an effective tool. And if you take the view they are a tool, and they are a mechanism by which the international community can attempt to change behavior, then if they're not being effective, they're a bit of a waste of time.
Before we round up the episode, we're going to dish out some quick fire questions for you, if that's okay.
Okay, finger on buzzers.
Can you sum up the difference between transaction monitoring and screening in one sentence?
If it's a very long sentence, transaction screening is a immediate decision at a point in time. Transaction monitoring is an analysis of behavior over time.
What keeps you excited about the financial crime space?
The space in general, I think it's a really interesting mix of technology because it is a space with very large organizations, very large money flows. You know, the desire to use leading edge technology to reduce the cost of compliance, to steal a march on your competitors, you know, that really drives it forward. So for me, that's always fascinating. It's also very real world. You know, we all participate in the financial sector in one way or another. So although you can view these things as abstract, actually, you know, I know my payments are going through these systems. So it's a very real part of your life. And there are real problems. It quite often gets described as an arms race. You know, money launderers, terrorism are putting an awful lot of money at trying to work around the controls that are being put in place, which means this year and last year are very different places. So it keeps it, sorry, this is quickfire, isn't it? So it keeps it very alive and it keeps it very dynamic because it is a race.
And final one, what's the one thing compliance and AML professionals should take from this episode?
It'll sound boring, but I'm going to go back to understand your organization's obligations and your own risk appetite. There is technology that will do screening for you. You get the best out of it if you really understand your organization's risk appetite and your policies and processes so you can actually screen the least you need to.
And that brings this spin of the laundry to an end. Nick, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find out more about you and connect?
I'm on LinkedIn and obviously the Napier website.
Money makes the world go round.
And thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, check out the back catalog and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. We'd also love for you to share the episode on social media channels, tell your colleagues about it, drop an episode in a group chat. It really does help people find us. If you got a story that you would like to share with us, you can comment on the Strise LinkedIn page, my LinkedIn page, or email laundry@strise.ai. Your host for this episode was me, Fredrik. Our producer was Matthew. Our engineers were Dominic and Nicholas. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud. Visit strise.ai for more information. See you next time.
There is no spoon.
There is no spoon.
The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud.